Howdy everyone, again it is Shayla, and today I want to talk about Monster, the show on Netflix about Jeffrey Dahmer. If you've been living under a rock for the last couple months, essentially Netflix released a show in late September covering Jeffrey Dahmer's life and crimes, pretty much interwoven through all the episodes. There's episodes with his childhood, there's episodes where he's caught for his crimes, and it ends with the episode where he is ultimately murdered in prison by another inmate for what he did. Now, before diving into this video, I do want to give a content warning. We are going to be talking about some pretty rough and potentially triggering topics today, which I will show on the screen. If you don't feel like you're in the mental space to handle those topics, please don't watch this video. No video online is worth your mental health and sanity. With that out of the way, I want to start with what Monster does well. I feel like it is extremely well acted. I feel like the dialogue is well written. It is well shot. And I really commend everyone involved for putting their best effort in. I feel like all the actors tried to approach their roles with a lot of respect to the real people. The show brings up a lot of police negligence, particularly with Conarax and Thasome. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've been looking it up this whole time to try and get it correct. And they really messed up by returning him to Dahmer. The show also brings to light that Dahmer was targeting marginalized men. Before seeing the show, I thought Dahmer had killed a bunch of white people. I didn't know that he targeted particularly men of color because he knew he could get away with it. He also had on his side the fact that a lot of gay men were not reporting crimes during this time period because they didn't want to be outed to their parents or their families or their friends. The show also helps us recognize that a lot of these men had the cards stacked against them, particularly Tony Hughes, because not only was he black and gay, he was also deaf. So he had a lot of overlapping issues which society often ignored. I couldn't name a Dahmer victim before watching this show. And I feel like that's really important to recognize, is that it did bring a lot of awareness to the victims and what happened to them. And when the show does things well, it does them really well. Particularly the episode Silence that focuses on Tony Hughes. We really get an insight into who Tony was as a person and his hopes and dreams and aspirations. And when we focus on the victims and what their lives were like outside of their encounter with Dahmer, that's where the show really excels. I feel like in a lot of crime media, we focus a lot on the criminals or the murderers, which I respect, because we do need to recognize how these people end up the way they are. We need to recognize how they got away with it. And it's important from a psychological standpoint to understand how people end up being the way that they are. But we also should bring a light to the victims because ultimately they are the people that suffered. And as far as the true crime genre goes, I feel like it's a genre that is okay to have a healthy interest in. I've seen a lot of backlash lately towards people that watch true crime, people with the sentiment saying well, I'm not like other people, I'm not disgusting and watch true crime videos. There's nothing wrong with liking true crime videos. There is nothing wrong with a healthy curiosity about psychology and how the mind works and what happens to people to make them how they are. And I think it's important to recognize what happens to these people potentially so we can stop it from happening in the future. How we treat each other could potentially push someone over the edge. I'm not saying that's what happened with Dahmer, but I'm saying that that's sometimes what happens with other people. It's compounding effects of society. It is systemic issues that end up causing people to snap sometimes. And that is something that needs to be talked about. And I do believe that the Dahmer case is an important one. It's multifaceted in the ways in which Dahmer became the kind of person he was. He was facing a world which had rampant homophobia. He was in a home where his parents were constantly arguing. We don't know if all of these things compounded and made him who he was. There's even one very good scene in Monster where Dahmer is talking to his father and he's trying to tell him that he's having these dark thoughts and he doesn't know what to do with them. And his dad kind of brushes him aside and says, oh, like, let's get you into college. Like, we'll get you into the best school. It's all gonna be okay. And that's not what he needed at that moment. I'm not saying that Dahmer's dad is completely responsible for how he ended up, because I believe that your children have autonomy. At a certain point, whatever your children do is their choice. Maybe had Dahmer had a healthier environment, maybe if he felt comfortable talking about his thoughts and feelings, he wouldn't have done what he did. This is brought up in the show or the movie My Friend Dahmer, which is John Backderf's own story about growing up with Dahmer. So he actually knew him, he wrote a comic book of the same name, and then he was directly involved with the making of that movie. Essentially, John Backderf brings up in My Friend Dahmer that maybe had things gone differently for Dahmer, he would have not have been a normal guy, but at max he might have just been a hermit who never left his house. I forget the exact quote that's in the movie, but that was the sentiment that was being relayed to the audience. I also feel like My Friend Dahmer, while I'm on the subject of it, is a much more ethical telling of Dahmer's story, particularly because it just covers how he became the person he was. And with John Backderf growing up with him, he has every right to make a story about Jeffrey Dahmer. However, Monster is made by people that were not directly involved in the Dahmer case, and like a lot of shows and dramatizations, it has a lot of issues, which we're now going to dive into. One of the first big factual inaccuracies I noticed in Dahmer was the fact that Glenda Cleveland did not live next door to him. She lived in a completely different building. So all of these scenes where she's, hearing noises through her vent and she can smell the stench of bodies in the other room and knocking on Dahmer's door and the whole sandwich confrontation they have, none of that happened to her. There are articles that I reference in this video that talked about a woman named Pamela Bass, and there's theories that her and Glenda Cleveland were essentially smushed into one person for the purposes of Monster. The problem with that is that a bunch of that shit is now made up. Glenda never knocked on his door. They never had this confrontation that was very tense over this sandwich that she didn't want to eat. That did not happen to her. And unfortunately, Glenda Cleveland died in 2011, so she's not around to critique or give her opinion on her portrayal in Monster. But little factual inaccuracies like this lead to scenes that are completely irrelevant. They didn't happen at all. They're put in for, dramatic tension. And after I found out about this, I found even more inaccuracies. One of the biggest ones that bugs me is Tony Hughes and Jeffrey Dahmer's relationship. This is all portrayed in episode 6, Silenced, where we see Hughes and Dahmer almost have like a cute relationship where they're like writing notes to each other because Tony is deaf, so he can only communicate either through sign language or through writing. And, they're eating lunches together. Dahmer has a scene with his stepmom and his father being like, oh my god, I have a friend now, things are really turning around for me. Dahmer claims that he did not know Hughes for more than the night that he killed him. He didn't know him before that. Friends and family of Hughes are claiming that he knew Dahmer for about a year to 2 years, but no one knows what their relationship was. And it just feels a little gross to me to have scenes of them, being cutesy with each other, being romantic with each other, when we don't know what their relationship was. We don't know what their conversations were. It feels incredibly gross to me to make all of that shit up for a compelling story, and it feels tonally off when you think about how Dahmer did not deeply care for his victims. Before I watched the show, I kept hearing about how Dahmer had a boyfriend, but I don't really know if I would call Tony Hughes his boyfriend. And if it were me or one of my loved ones and someone made up a bunch of romantic things between myself or my deceased loved one and the person who killed them and then profited off of it, I would be pretty pissed off. One of the most heartbreaking things about the whole arc with Tony Hughes is knowing that his mother, Shirley Hughes, is not happy about this portrayal of herself and her family in this show. She was quoted saying that the relationship between Tony and Dahmer didn't happen like that, and she's also upset that they basically used their likenesses and they could do that without permission. Other little factual inaccuracies include the fact that Dahmer did not drink a bag of blood in his house. I remember seeing that scene and being disgusted, but also I was like, did this really happen? They did it so almost cinematically, like in this way where I don't want to say it's glorification, but it's an embellishment. And that's ultimately the detriment of Monster, is that it is full of embellishments. Dahmer didn't drink a bag of blood. What had happened was when he was working at that, I think it was like a hospital of some sort, he went on top of the roof of the building, tried a vial of blood, and then spit it out. But that's a lot less cinematic than him scarfing down half a bag of blood and having it drip down his chest. Like, it's this fucking aesthetic thing that we needed to see. And then there's just unnecessary scenes that are completely not needed in the show at all. For example, they have a scene of Ed Gein. It's sitting in a prison cell, and then we see one of his victims hanging up, upside down, completely naked, covered in blood, in some type of cabin. And if that wasn't enough, the thing that disturbed me the most was, I forget what episode it was in, but there is an opener where it has John Wayne Gacy, and he had a guy come over, he drugged him, and then he starts torturing him by like dunking his head in a bathtub. This was an incredibly disturbing scene. The scene after that is Glenda at work talking about Gacy and Dahmer with some coworkers. The episode would have played out exactly the same without that added horrific scene. It wasn't needed. They added it for shock value. They were trying to draw a correlation between Dahmer and Gacy. You can do that without showing me John Wayne Gacy murdering someone. That was not needed. And there are people online boasting about how they're like, I'm so tough. I was eating spaghetti while watching the Dahmer show. And as someone who loves the horror genre, I can deal with extensive amounts of gore when I know it's not about real people. But just seeing bits where Dahmer's making out with severed heads and he's cuddling on the victims he just murdered, it feels gross. It feels gross. Watching him eat what we're assuming to be Tony Hughes' liver at one point just feels gross. You can have things insinuated without showing them to me. I believe that you should be able to put whatever you want in your media when it comes to how extreme you want it to be. But when it comes to real people, you have to have consideration for how those people's families are going to react, especially since Dahmer's victims' families are still alive. It's not like they're all gone and they don't remember Dahmer. They are still affected by this to this day. There is a bit of information I want to give about one of the victims' family members, Rita Isbell, who was the sister of Errol Lindsay. This quote was going all around Twitter, where she essentially said she felt Netflix was harsh and careless about making this show, and that she felt like people should be being compensated, particularly the children and grandchildren of the victims. However, and this is a direct quote from Rita Isbell's interview with Insider, she said, "The show bringing up old feelings did hurt, but it also benefits me. I benefit from it because I can deal with it differently today than I did in the past. I can talk about it with not as much anger." So there is someone that has been affected by this show, but she's almost able to put like a positive spin on it as like, yes, people are going to bring up Dahmer and talk about him, but I can now talk about it without as much anger and upset as I was in the past. In this article, she also talks about the fact that she can tell everyone that Errol Lindsay had a daughter. Her name's Tatiana Banks, and Rita Isbell makes very clear that she wants the world to know that, like, he had a daughter, and also he has a granddaughter too, and she says that she has to keep him alive for his daughter. And if this show hadn't come out, potentially people wouldn't even know about Errol Lindsay and his daughter and the family he left behind. So there is a little bit of mixed opinion between the victims' families on if this show was a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's both. I think it's good that they brought up the systemic issues as to why Dahmer was able to get away with what he did for so long, but it also is under this thick layer of embellishments that it doesn't need. A lot of real true crime cases are already compelling enough because of the horrors that happened. You don't need to add on to that. Now, what's the point of talking about all of this? I think there's ethical ways to talk about true crime. I know that there's people almost calling out the genre for even existing, which I think is wrong, because people are allowed to have interest and explore them and be interested in why these types of things happen. However, I think a lot of people need to think about how others are going to feel about hearing this information, particularly the victims and their families. There's a lot of true crime YouTube content going around, and I think it's a little gross to do things like eat while doing videos about crimes, or maybe like doing your makeup and things like that. It's a little iffy. There are true crime channels that are very respectful and do things very tastefully. My favorite that really actually kind of got me into the genre of watching true crime YouTube is a channel called Dreading. It's this man and his brother, I believe, and they don't even show their faces in the videos. They just show pictures of the victims, pictures of the murderers. They show court footage and things like that. And that feels like the most ethical way to go about talking about true crime, is just presenting the facts and how they happened and not really splicing in a whole lot of opinion, and just presenting it as it was dealt with by the justice system. I also think it is nice, though, for true crime channels to talk about the victims and what their lives were like, what their interests were, who they were before the crime happened, so we can get a sense that this was a real person, like I said earlier in this video, someone with hopes and dreams and aspirations. I don't think people are gross for watching The Dahmer Show. I don't think people are gross for watching any Netflix series about a crime. I think it's perfectly natural to be curious about these things. And I don't think it's right that we're going around shaming people, being like, if you watched Monster, you too are a monster. You're not a monster. You watched one of the most popular shows on Netflix at the time. I don't blame anyone for clicking on it and being like, oh, this might be interesting, especially people who had never really dove in to anything about Jeffrey Dahmer. And I do believe that you can make a show with like actors and cinematography and all of that stuff and create a show that is respectful to the victims of a true crime. But it takes a lot more due diligence than what happened here. I don't blame the actors or, set designers, hair and makeup people for any of this being involved. And I do think that a lot of the people involved had pure intentions. Even Evan Peters tried to say that the one rule Ryan Murphy wanted to have for this was that it wouldn't be told from Dahmer's perspective. Unfortunately, when most of the series focuses on Dahmer, it is kind of from Dahmer's perspective. And whether you think that's right or not, that is what happened. And it kind of makes Dahmer into this character. And I don't think they did what they wanted to do. I think they wanted to do a very respectful retelling. And I think what happened was half really good retelling half really good, bringing to light things that need to be talked about. But those two things are under this giant layer of factual inaccuracies and embellishments and almost like aesthetic shots that are extremely disrespectful. And I hope in the future, when other people decide that they want to create series about true crime cases, that they could maybe try to do it in a way that's more factually accurate and less about creating an even larger than life horrific story. That is it for this video. I hope you guys liked hearing me shout into the void my opinions on Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. I think that's what it's called. It has a very long title. We need to stop giving these shows extremely long titles. I remember the Ted Bundy one with Zac Efron was like shockingly evil, suspiciously vile, and nasty. Like it had some Panic at the Disco length title with it. And I'm like, you could have just given it a short one, I guess. Anyways, if you like this video, please subscribe if you want to hear me screech about other topics in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!